The forest was mourning. The great grizzly had once been strong, her muscles rippling beneath a thick coat of fur, her eyes sharp and bright. Now, she was a shadow of her former self, her ribs beginning to show, her head hanging lower, her breath coming in labored huffs as she moved through the undergrowth. The loss of her cub had stolen something vital from her. She had searched for days, following scents and broken twigs, listening for even the faintest cry. But there was nothing. The earth gave no answers, and the wind carried no trace of him. It could have been hunters, though she had not heard the sharp crack of a rifle. It could have been the river, swollen with late spring melt, sweeping him away. It could have been fate, cruel and unrelenting. Whatever it was, she did not understand, only that a part of her had been taken. The bear's deep, sorrowful cry echoed through the valley, startling birds from their nests. The forest, once her sanctuary, felt empty, hostile. Her instincts told her to keep moving, to search, but her body was beginning to fail. She had barely eaten, too consumed with the desperate need to find her child. Every scent on the breeze, every rustling leaf, sent her heart racing, only for it to be nothing. Her grief was all-consuming. Not far from the grieving mother bear, nestled in a clearing at the edge of the wilderness, stood a small cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, and golden light flickered behind the windows as evening settled in. Inside, Emily sat in a rocking chair, cradling her son, Samuel. The baby was warm against her chest. His tiny fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater. She hummed softly, rocking back and forth, feeling the rhythm soothe them both. She had always loved the quiet of the forest. When she and her husband, James, had first moved here, she had been nervous about the isolation. But in time, she had grown to appreciate the stillness, the way the seasons shaped their days. James, a park ranger, was gone for long stretches, patrolling the vast expanse of wilderness, ensuring the safety of both the land and the people who ventured into it. That night, as she sat with Samuel, a deep sound rumbled through the trees, a low, mournful wail. She tensed, her arms instinctively tightening around her son. It was an animal's cry, but not one of anger or warning. It was something deeper, more painful. Emily rose carefully, moving to the window. The world outside was bathed in the last light of dusk. Shadows stretched long across the ground, the trees swaying in the gentle wind. She saw nothing unusual, but the sound haunted her. A mother's grief. She recognized it instantly. She had heard stories of the grizzlies that roamed these woods, but she had never encountered one up close. They were creatures of power and wild beauty, but also of deep instinct. A mother bear would tear through the world itself to protect her young. Emily understood the feeling all too well. She looked down at Samuel, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. The warmth of him, the weight of his little body against hers, was everything. She had felt fear before, loneliness in the early days of motherhood, exhaustion that threatened to pull her under, but she had never felt loss. She could not imagine it. Outside, the grieving bear continued her search. She moved through the darkness, her powerful body stumbling from hunger and fatigue. She could still smell him, faint and fading, mixed with the scents of the pines, the damp earth, the cold bite of the wind. She had followed every trace, every whisper of his presence, only for it to lead to nothing. But she would not give up. She would search until her body could no longer carry her. Emily shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around Samuel. The forest was alive with unseen eyes, with creatures living out their stories in the night. Somewhere out there, a mother searched for her child, her pain vibrating through the trees. She whispered a soft prayer, not knowing who it was for, the bear, herself, or the fragile, fleeting moments of love that made life unbearable to lose. The evening air was cool and crisp as Emily stepped outside. A woven basket balanced on her hip as she gathered firewood. The sky, streaked with the last golden light of the day, darkened at the edges, a deep blue settling over the forest. The wind rustled the trees, sending leaves fluttering like whispers through the air. Inside the cabin, Samuel lay in his crib by the open window, wrapped snugly in a soft, hand-knit blanket. His tiny chest rose and fell with the gentle rhythm of sleep. The crackling fire cast flickering shadows across the wooden walls, a comforting warmth filling the small home. Emily had only stepped outside for a moment, just long enough to gather a few more pieces of wood for the night. As she bent down, reaching for a particularly dry log, a deep, low growl rumbled through the trees. The sound sent a cold shiver down her spine. It was not the distant howl of a wolf or the chirring of night insects. This was something else, something close. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the clearing. And then she saw her. The mother bear stood at the edge of the trees, her massive form barely visible in the twilight. Her fur was ragged, her ribs visible beneath her thick coat, her eyes hollow with something that sent terror pulsing through Emily's veins. Grief. Emily had never seen such sorrow in an animal before. It was a raw, aching thing, radiating from the bear's hulking frame. And then, as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the trees, the bear's gaze lifted, past Emily, past the flickering firelight, to the open window, to the crib, to Samuel. For a heartbeat, there was silence, the world frozen in a terrible, fragile balance. Then the bear moved. Emily barely had time to scream. The great beast surged forward with a speed that defied her weakened state, her massive paws thudding against the earth. Emily's basket tumbled to the ground as she ran, her heart slamming against her ribs. "No!" she cried, her voice strangled with terror. The bear reached the cabin in seconds, her heavy breath misting in the cool air. Her sorrow-filled eyes softened as she peered into the crib, as if she had found something that had been stolen from her. Samuel stirred, letting out a small, sleepy whimper, and in that instant, the mother bear made her choice, with the gentleness of a creature that had once cradled her own cub. She lifted the baby into her massive arms. The tiny child barely stirred as he was wrapped in a thick blanket of fur, his tiny hands curling instinctively into the warmth. Emily's scream tore through the night. She ran, her legs pumping, her feet barely feeling the ground beneath them. She lunged toward the bear, toward her child, but the beast was already turning, already moving back toward the trees. "No, stop, please," Emily sobbed, her voice breaking as she stumbled forward, her hands grasping at nothing. But the bear did not stop. She vanished into the forest, her heavy footfalls fading into the night, her massive body swallowed by the darkness. Emily ran after her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She tripped over roots, branches clawing at her skin. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her child, her baby, was being carried away by a grieving, desperate mother who had lost her own. Tears blurred her vision as she pushed deeper into the forest. The trees loomed tall and unyielding, their gnarled limbs casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. The cold air stung her lungs, her body shaking from exhaustion and fear. And then, her foot caught on a root. The world spun as she tumbled forward, her body hitting the damp earth hard. Pain shot through her knee, her hands scraping against rough bark. She gasped, struggling to push herself up, to keep going. But the forest was silent. The bear was gone, and so was Samuel. Emily let out a raw, anguished cry, her body trembling as she pressed her hands against the ground. The weight of the night, of her helplessness, crushed her. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, as if mourning with her. Her baby was gone. The forest was silent as the mother bear carried the tiny child through the underbrush, her massive paws treading softly against the damp earth. The moon hung low, its pale light casting long shadows between the trees, illuminating the trail that led her home. The weight in her arms was warm, soft, delicate, just as her cub had been. The scent was unfamiliar, but the shape, the feel, the tiny murmurs of breath, these stirred something deep within her. She moved with purpose, her great body weaving through the dense wilderness with ease, driven by an instinct older than time. The den was close, nestled beneath a fallen tree where the earth sloped downward, forming a sheltered hollow. This was where she had birthed her cub, where she had curled around him on cold nights, where she had nuzzled his tiny body as he pressed into her warmth. But he had been taken from her. She did not know how. She did not understand the cruelty of the world that had stolen him away. The emptiness had gnawed at her, an aching wound that no food, no movement, no sound could fill. And then, this, a gift from the night, a fragile thing placed into her path, calling to something inside her that had been broken. The mother bear stepped into the den, the familiar scent of earth and fur wrapping around her like a blanket. She settled onto the soft bed of dried leaves and moss, cradling the child against her chest, breathing him in. The baby did not cry. Instead, he cooed softly, the sound a whisper in the quiet of the night. His tiny fingers curled against her fur, grasping without knowing, seeking warmth, seeking comfort, and she gave it to him. She licked his face gently, the way she had once groomed her own cub, the way a mother soothes her young. Her massive paw, so powerful, so deadly, rested over him with the lightest touch, a shield against the dark. For a moment, she believed. For a moment, the hole inside her seemed to close. But then, something was wrong. The scent, so different. The skin, too bare, too smooth. The body, too still, too unfamiliar. The illusion trembled at the edges. The mother bear lifted her head, her great dark eyes searching the shadows of the den as if the answer was hidden there. She inhaled deeply, her nose seeking the scent she had lost, the scent of her own cub. The one who had nestled against her with tiny, needful cries. The one who had known her scent, her warmth, her heartbeat. But the scent was gone. Instead, there was only this strange, fragile thing, blinking up at her with wide, wondering eyes. The baby reached a tiny hand toward her, his lips parting in a soft, breathy sound, and the truth came crashing down. Her cub was gone, the small, lifeless body she had nudged, again and again, trying to wake him, the coldness that had settled over him as she had roared her grief to the trees. The long, desperate search, the scent trails that led to nowhere, the hunger that clawed at her belly but could not compare to the emptiness inside. And now, this, not her cub, not hers. A sound rumbled from deep within her chest. Not a growl, not a roar, something softer, something lost. She lowered her head, pressing her nose against the child, searching, hoping, trying to hold onto the lie for just a moment longer. But the lie would not hold. She had not found her cub. She had stolen someone else's. The mother bear's massive body trembled as she curled around the child, torn between the primal, instinctive need to nurture and the unbearable truth of what she had done. Her great heart ached, her breath shuddering in the stillness of the den. The baby stirred against her, unafraid, content in the warmth of the creature that had taken him. A mother's love was a force beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond what the world could understand. It was fierce and wild and consuming. And in her grief, the bear had tried to rewrite the laws of nature, to fill the unbearable void in her heart with something, anything, that felt like what she had lost. But love could not bring back the dead. And love could not make this child hers. The weight of her loss crushed down on her. As heavy as the mountains. As endless as the sky. She let out a low, keening sound, her body wrapping around the child one last time. A mother's love had brought her here. And now, a mother's love would force her to let go. Emily stumbled through the dense undergrowth. Her body bruised, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The night had been endless. An eternity of running, falling, pushing herself forward despite the searing pain in her limbs and the terror clawing at her heart. The bear's tracks were barely visible in the dim moonlight. But she followed them with the desperation of a mother who had nothing left to lose. Her child was out there. Somewhere in the vast, uncaring wilderness. Samuel was alone, cradled in the arms of a creature that did not understand what it had done. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic surging through her. But she shoved it down. Fear could not help her now. Only movement, only the hunt. The forest was waking as dawn's first light touched the sky, painting the treetops in pale gold. The world felt strangely still, as if holding its breath. Emily's legs trembled with exhaustion. Her hands scraped and raw from catching herself against rough bark, from pushing through thorn-laden brambles. She had lost track of how many times she had fallen, how many times she had forced herself back up. And then, a break in the trees. A hollow beneath the roots of an ancient fallen tree. A den hidden in the shadows. Emily's breath caught. The scent of earth and damp fur reached her nose. And just beyond the tangled branches, she saw them. The bear lay curled within the den, her massive body rising and falling in deep, steady breaths. And there, nestled against her thick fur, was Samuel. The baby was still, his tiny face peaceful, his soft fingers resting against the beast's coarse coat. He was warm, safe, untouched. Emily let out a sharp, broken sob, pressing a hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Relief and terror warred within her, her body shaking so violently she thought she might collapse. The bear stirred, slowly, the great head lifted, dark eyes blinking against the pale morning light. She turned toward Emily, and for the first time, their eyes met. Two mothers, one human, one beast. Grief mirrored between them, a wordless, primal understanding passing between their locked gazes. Emily's hands trembled at her sides. Her body tensed to flee. But she did not run. She could not. The bear's eyes, deep, knowing, aching with sorrow, lingered on the baby in her embrace. The illusion that had carried her through the night had crumbled. The fragile dream of reclaiming what had been lost now nothing but dust in the morning light. She knew, this child was not hers. A slow, heavy exhale left the bear's massive chest. Then, with the gentleness of a creature who had once known the weight of her own cub, she shifted, her massive paws, so capable of destruction, so powerful and unforgiving, moved with careful, deliberate tenderness. She lifted Samuel, her great head lowering as she cradled the baby one last time. A final touch, a final breath. Then, with a silent decision, she rose to her full, towering height. Emily did not move as the bear took a slow step forward, the earth barely shifting beneath her weight. Fear screamed in the back of her mind. But something deeper, older, held her still. The bear extended her massive head, lowering the child toward her. Emily gasped, hands flying forward as she reached for her son. The moment Samuel's warmth was against her chest. A sob wrenched from deep within her, her knees buckling as she clutched him close. His small body stirred, his tiny face pressing against her. And the world that had been shattering around her suddenly righted itself. Her baby, safe, alive. Tears streamed down her face as she pressed frantic kisses to his forehead, rocking him gently, whispering his name over and over as if she could bind him to her. As if she could erase the horror of the night with sheer will alone. When she finally lifted her head, the bear was still there, watching. Emily could see it now, the weight of loss carved into the great beast's form. The exhaustion draped over her like a second skin. This was not a monster. This was a mother who had tried, in her own desperate, grief-stricken way, to mend what had been broken. And now, she was letting go. The bear held Emily's gaze for a long, aching moment, then turned. Silent, steady, she walked away, her massive frame disappearing into the trees, swallowed by the shifting shadows of the forest. Emily clutched her child tighter, watching until the last trace of brown fur melted into the wilderness. Then, with Samuel safe in her arms, she turned toward home, her heart still hammering, her body still trembling. The forest had taken, the forest had given back. And somewhere in its vast, endless depths, a mother bear walked alone. Her sorrow carried with her into the quiet, waiting dark. Weeks passed, the seasons shifting imperceptibly as the days grew longer and the warm breath of summer returned to the hills and valleys. The air smelled of pine and wildflowers, of earth warmed by the sun, and the world seemed to carry on, undisturbed by the events that had torn through the lives of Emily and her son. Life had settled into a new rhythm, one born of deep gratitude and quiet healing. Emily had her child in her arms again, and the terror that had gripped her heart when she realized he was gone seemed like a distant memory now, one that lived only in the shadows of her mind. Yet, the memory of that night, of the bear's silent gaze, of the sorrow that had mirrored her own, lingered in Emily's thoughts. She could not forget the way the bear had looked at her, as if understanding that both of their worlds had been altered, and nothing would ever be quite the same. The thought of the great beast, wandering the forest, still haunted by her own loss, stirred something deep within Emily's heart, something she could not ignore. One afternoon, as the sun sank low, casting a golden glow across the meadow, Emily stood by the cabin, her eyes drifting toward the forest's edge. Samuel, now a bit older, was playing near the cabin, his soft laughter carried by the wind. But her thoughts drifted. The trees at the edge of the woods were thick with the whispering of leaves, their shadows long and inviting. Emily had learned to trust her instincts, to know when something was different, when the stillness of the woods held a quiet promise. And then, there it was, at the very edge of the trees, standing still as a statue. The great mother bear appeared, her dark eyes watching from a distance. The bear was no longer the frantic, grief-stricken creature who had taken Samuel so many weeks ago. She was standing, poised, calm, as though she had finally accepted the reality of her loss. The wild, untamable energy that had once driven her through the forest in search of what she had lost seemed to have faded, replaced by something softer, more accepting. Emily did not move. She simply stood there, her heart beating in her chest, watching the bear from a distance, understanding that the creature who had once stolen her child now watched over them from afar. The bond between them, unspoken yet profound, lingered in the air between them. Both mothers, both survivors. The bear did not approach, but neither did she leave immediately. She lingered there, her massive form almost blending into the shadows, her gaze fixed on Emily, on her son. The bear's presence was not a threat, it was a quiet acknowledgement, a silent understanding that needed no words. There was no need for anything more. The bear had let go of what she had lost, just as Emily had. There was peace now. Emily took a deep breath, her chest tight with emotion. She glanced down at Samuel, who was still playing, unaware of the silent exchange taking place at the forest's edge. In her hands, she held something, a simple offering. She had been preparing it for days, unsure whether the bear would even be near, unsure whether it would matter. But she had to do something, some small gesture of thanks, some way to honor the creature who had given her back the most precious thing in her life. Carefully, Emily stepped forward, moving to a large rock near the trees. She placed a piece of bread on the stone, and then drizzled a bit of honey over it. The sweet scent wafted into the air, mingling with the natural smells of the forest. It was a humble offering, but it was all she had, a symbol of gratitude and respect for the wild, for the bear who had returned her son, and for the mother who had known loss as deeply as she had. When she stepped back, Emily turned to look at the bear. Their eyes met again. Across the distance, the bear did not move toward the offering. She did not step forward or make any noise. She simply stood there, still as the trees, her gaze steady and unwavering. For a long moment, they looked at one another, a silent bond shared between them. There were no words to be spoken. The bear had no need for the bread, no need for the honey. It was not the offering that mattered, it was the gesture. The acknowledgement that they were both mothers, both creatures of love and loss, both carrying the weight of grief and the strength of survival. With a final, slow movement, the bear turned away, disappearing into the forest as silently as she had come. Emily watched her go, the enormous figure blending into the shadows of the trees. Disappearing from sight, she stood there for a long while, her breath caught in her throat, her heart full. Samuel tugged on her sleeve, pulling her out of her reverie. "Mama," he said, his voice soft and innocent. Emily smiled down at him, her hand gently smoothing his hair. "Yes, darling," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Who were you looking at?" Emily paused, her gaze drifting back to the place where the bear had stood. "Just someone who's watching over us, sweetie. Just someone who understands." And though Samuel did not understand, Emily felt it, deep in her bones, the unspoken bond between them all. Somewhere, deep in the forest, another mother carried a love as fierce as her own. And though their worlds would never truly touch, that bond would remain, silently holding them together in the wild, untamed heart of nature.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.